Safety, they said, was supposed to come with freedom. But what happens when the people who finally taste liberty start vanishing one by one? And the only ones who notice are those with nowhere to turn. What happens when silence becomes a weapon, and the disappeared are mourned only by those society pretends don't exist? This is what happened in Georgia's Ashland County in the years after the Civil War. What makes it more disturbing is that it took decades before anyone outside that community even acknowledged something had gone wrong. This is the story of how an entire system conspired to pretend crimes weren't happening, even as the evidence mounted. This is the story of one man who refused to look away, and the price his community paid for seeking truth in a place where truth was dangerous. Thomas Hayes had spent 34 years of his life as property. 34 years waking before dawn to work land he would never own, raising crops that would fill mouths that were not his, building wealth for a family that considered him livestock. The Barlow plantation stretched across 300 acres of Georgia red clay, cotton fields that seemed to extend to the edge of the world itself. Thomas had arrived there at age 14, sold away from his mother and siblings in Virginia, a transaction that took less time than buying a horse. He learned quickly that survival meant making yourself valuable. He taught himself to read by studying a Bible he'd stolen from the plantation house library, risking a beating or worse if he'd been caught. He practiced letters by scratching them into the dirt behind his cabin, then smoothing them away before anyone could see. By the time he was 20, he could read better than the plantation owner's son, though he was careful never to let anyone know. When the war ended and word finally reached the Barlow plantation in the spring of 1865, Thomas stood in the cotton fields with 19 other formerly enslaved people and wept. The overseer, a man named Gideon Watts who had wielded his whip with casual cruelty for 15 years, delivered the news with barely contained rage. "You're free," he'd said, making the word sound like a curse. "Government says you can go. Where you'll go and how you'll survive, that's your problem now." They had no money, no education beyond what they taught themselves in secret, no legal protections worth the paper they were printed on. But they had something they had never possessed before, the right to leave. Most did. They scattered like seeds on the wind. Some headed north toward rumored factory jobs, others west toward open territory. Many simply walked until they found somewhere that didn't remind them of chains. Sarah Clemens left first, determined to find her daughter, who had been sold to a plantation in Alabama 8 years earlier. Marcus Phelps headed for Atlanta, where he'd heard freed slaves were building their own schools and churches. The younger ones, those who had no memories tying them to this particular piece of Georgia, left without looking back. But Thomas stayed. Not because he loved Ashland County or felt any attachment to the red clay soil that had drunk his sweat for over 3 decades. He stayed because his wife, Ruth, was buried there in an unmarked grave on the edge of the plantation cemetery where the enslaved were laid to rest. His daughter, Clara, was buried beside her. Both had died of fever in the brutal summer of 1859, when Thomas had been forced to watch them suffer while working in the fields because the plantation doctor said their illness wasn't serious enough to excuse him from his labor. His son, Daniel, had also stayed. Daniel was 31 now, born into slavery but freed at an age where he still had strength and hope. Daniel had managed to secure a small patch of land just 5 miles from the old plantation, 40 acres that a northern carpetbagger had sold for almost nothing, more interested in quick cash than a fair price. The soil was poor and the land prone to flooding, but it was land Daniel could work for himself. Thomas wasn't alone in staying. About 60 formerly enslaved people remained in Ashland County after the war. Most clustered in an area that came to be known as Freeman's Quarter, though no official documents called it that, and certainly no map showed it. It was land nobody else wanted, swampy in the rainy season when the Ocoee River overflowed its banks, hard-packed and stubborn in drought when the sun baked the earth into something resembling brick. There were rattlesnakes in the tall grass and mosquitoes thick as fog in the summer evenings. But it was theirs, or as close to theirs as anything could be in a place where the law was still written by those who had recently owned them. They built homes from scavenged wood and determination. Thomas constructed his cabin from planks salvaged from an old tobacco barn that had collapsed during a storm, mixing clay and moss to fill the gaps between boards. It was 12 feet by 10, with a stone fireplace he built himself and a roof that only leaked in 3 places. He'd lived in worse, much worse. They planted vegetables in soil they had to coax into cooperation: okra, collard greens, sweet potatoes, beans. They established a small church in a structure that had once been used for drying tobacco, hauling out the old racks and installing rough-hewn benches that Daniel and 2 other men constructed. Someone found an old bell, cracked but still functional, and mounted it outside. When it rang on Sunday mornings, the sound carried across the settlement, calling people to worship. Thomas, who had learned to read by secretly studying that stolen Bible years earlier, became the informal record keeper for the community. He wrote down births and deaths, marriages and land arrangements, keeping everything in a ledger he'd purchased with the first money he'd ever earned as a free man, payment for a week's work repairing a fence for a farmer who had actually honored his promise to pay. The ledger was precious to him. It represented proof that their lives mattered, that their community existed, that they were people with histories worth recording. He kept it wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp, and he wrote in it by candlelight in the evenings, his entries careful and methodical. January 15, 1866. Birth of Henry Tucker, son of Samuel and Martha Tucker. Healthy boy, 8 pounds. February 3, 1866. Marriage of James Foster and Caroline Webb. Ceremony performed by Thomas Hayes, myself, in the church. Witnessed by entire community. March 12, 1866. Death of Moses Crawford. Age approximately 72. Cause, natural decline. Buried in the church cemetery. For 2 years, life was hard but hopeful. The community grew slowly. A few more families arrived, refugees from nearby areas where hostility toward freed slaves had turned violent. The church congregation swelled to nearly 80 people. Children were born, the first generation to take their first breaths in freedom, to never know the weight of chains, though they would learn soon enough that freedom itself could be a complicated thing in a place that resented their existence. A schoolteacher named Margaret Lawson arrived from Atlanta in the spring of 1867, a light-skinned woman in her 30s who'd been educated in the North. She started teaching children and many adults to read in the church building after services on Sundays. Thomas attended her classes despite his age, wanting to improve beyond the rudimentary literacy he'd taught himself. Margaret brought books, precious and rare, and sometimes she would read aloud to the whole community, her voice bringing to life stories of distant places and different possibilities. Thomas's son, Daniel, married a woman named Rachel Washington, who had walked to Ashland County from South Carolina looking for an aunt she'd been separated from during the war. She never found her aunt, but she found a community that welcomed her. And in Daniel, she found something she'd thought was lost forever, the possibility of building a family that couldn't be torn apart at someone else's whim. When Rachel gave birth to a baby girl, they named her Ruth after Thomas's late wife. Thomas held his granddaughter for the first time on a warm evening in May 1867, this tiny creature with perfect fingers and lungs that could wail loud enough to wake the entire settlement. Looking down at her, feeling the weight of her in his arms, Thomas allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them. He was wrong. Benjamin Porter was the kind of man people noticed. Not because he was loud or boastful, but because of the quiet competence he brought to everything he did. At 26 years old, he stood just under 6 feet tall with hands that were equally skilled at delicate woodwork and heavy labor. He learned carpentry during slavery, apprenticed to a white craftsman who had grudgingly admitted that Benjamin had more natural talent than any white apprentice he'd trained. After freedom came, Benjamin set up a small workshop in a cabin on the eastern edge of Freeman's Quarter. He built furniture, chairs, tables, simple cabinets, bed frames. His work was good, sturdy and well made, with joints that fit tight and surfaces sanded smooth. Word spread, and soon he was taking orders from both black and white families in the area, though white customers usually sent servants to pick up the items rather than visit Freeman's Quarter themselves. Some white folks wouldn't even acknowledge where the furniture came from, preferring to pretend it had simply appeared rather than admit they paid a former slave for his craftsmanship. Benjamin lived alone. He'd been married once during slavery to a woman named Julia. They jumped the broom in a ceremony that had no legal weight but meant everything to them. 6 months later, Julia had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi. Benjamin had never seen her again, never learned what became of her, never stopped wondering if she was alive somewhere, if she ever thought of him, if she remembered the promises they'd made to each other under an oak tree on a Sunday afternoon. He didn't talk about her much, the pain was still too raw even years later. Instead, he threw himself into his work, finding a kind of meditation in the rhythm of planing wood, the satisfaction of seeing a piece of furniture take shape from raw lumber. His cabin was small but tidy, the workshop area taking up more space than his living quarters. Wood shavings covered the floor, and the smell of sawdust and wood varnish permeated everything. People liked Benjamin. He was steady, reliable, someone you could count on to do what he said he'd do. He attended church every Sunday, sitting in the back row and singing hymns in a surprisingly good baritone. He helped neighbors with repairs, never asking for payment unless they offered. When the church needed new benches, Benjamin built them at cost, spending 2 weeks on the project. On Wednesday, October 23, 1867, Benjamin walked into Ashland proper to purchase supplies from the general store. The store owner, a man named Albert Grayson, recorded the transaction in his ledger: £3 nails, 1 quart wood varnish, £2 sandpaper. Total cost, 90 cents. Benjamin paid and carried his purchases back toward Freeman's Quarter. That was the last confirmed sighting of Benjamin Porter. He didn't show up for church that Sunday, October 27. Thomas noticed his absence but didn't think much of it initially. Benjamin sometimes worked through Sundays when he had orders to fill, and there was no law saying attendance was mandatory. But by Monday evening, when Benjamin still hadn't been seen, Thomas felt the first stirring of concern. On Tuesday morning, Thomas walked to Benjamin's cabin. It was about a 20-minute walk from his own place, following a path that wound through pine trees and around a small pond where frogs sang in the evenings. The October air was crisp, leaves beginning to turn, the kind of weather that made you grateful to be alive. The cabin was quiet when Thomas arrived. Too quiet. No sounds of work coming from inside. No smoke rising from the chimney, even though mornings were getting cold enough that most people kept a small fire going. "Benjamin," Thomas called out, approaching the door. "You home?" No answer. Thomas tried the door. It was unlocked, swinging open easily. Inside, everything was exactly as Benjamin always kept it, organized and clean. The bed was made, the blankets tucked in with military precision. The workshop area was neat, tools arranged on the wall in careful order. A half-finished chair sat on the workbench, one leg still needing to be attached, the wood joints already cut and ready for assembly. On the small table that served as Benjamin's eating area, Thomas found a plate with remnants of a meal, cornbread crumbs, the stain of beans. The plate was dry, the food eaten days ago. Beside it was a cup, also empty. A candle had burned down to a stub. Nothing appeared disturbed. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood or indication of violence. Benjamin's few possessions were all present, his spare clothes hanging on pegs, his shaving razor on a shelf, a small wooden box where he kept his money. Thomas opened the box and found $3.40 inside, money Benjamin had been saving toward purchasing more tools. But Benjamin himself was gone. Thomas stood in the quiet cabin, feeling dread settle in his stomach like a stone. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. People didn't just disappear, leaving behind their money, their tools, their unfinished work, their entire life. He began asking around the community. Had anyone seen Benjamin since Wednesday? Sarah Tucker, who lived in the cabin nearest to Benjamin's, said she'd seen him return from town Wednesday evening carrying his purchases. I called out a greeting, she said. He waved back, seemed in good spirits, said he had work to finish, and went into his cabin. That's the last I saw of him. Samuel Wright, who sometimes helped Benjamin with large projects, said Benjamin had mentioned he was expecting to start a big order soon, a dining table and 8 chairs for a family in town. He was excited about it, Samuel said. Said it would be good money. He was going to use it to buy better lumber, maybe expand his workshop. Margaret Lawson, the schoolteacher, remembered Benjamin attending church 2 Sundays before his disappearance. He seemed perfectly normal, she said. Stayed after the service to help me arrange some books. We talked about maybe building some shelves for the school supplies. He said he'd be happy to do it. No one had any information that explained where Benjamin had gone or why. No one had seen anything unusual. No one had heard anything alarming. Thomas walked to the sheriff's office in Ashland proper, the white part of town, where freed slaves were tolerated during business hours but expected to be gone by sunset. The town itself was small, built around a central square with a courthouse at its center. The buildings were mostly wooden, some showing the wear of war years, others freshly painted in an attempt to reclaim pre-war prosperity. Sheriff William Parrish's office was on the ground floor of the courthouse, a room with a desk, a gun rack, and wanted posters on the walls. Parrish was a thick-necked man in his 50s who had served as a captain in the Confederate Army. He'd returned to Ashland County after the war and been elected sheriff within months, running on a platform that emphasized maintaining order and protecting traditional values, which everyone understood to mean keeping freed slaves in their place. Parrish was reading a newspaper when Thomas entered, boots propped on his desk. He looked up with obvious irritation at the interruption. "What do you want?" Parrish asked, not bothering with pleasantries. Thomas removed his hat, holding it in his hands, a gesture of deference he hated but knew was necessary. "I'd like to report a missing person, Sheriff." "Who?" "Benjamin Porter. He lives in Freeman's Quarter. Hasn't been seen since last Wednesday." Parrish lowered the newspaper slightly. "Benjamin Porter. That the boy who makes furniture?" "Yes, sir. He's 26 years old. He left his cabin sometime between Wednesday evening and Thursday morning. All his possessions are still there, including his money, his tools, and finished work. He wouldn't have left those behind willingly. Maybe he went to visit someone. You people wander around a lot, don't you?" Thomas kept his voice carefully neutral. "Benjamin has no family in the area, Sheriff. No reason to travel. And he had orders to fill, work scheduled. He's a reliable man. His disappearance is completely out of character." "Out of character?" Parrish swung his feet off the desk and leaned back in his chair, regarding Thomas with something between amusement and contempt. "You know what I think? I think your Benjamin Porter decided freedom meant he could just pick up and go wherever he wanted, whenever he wanted. Probably got bored with furniture making and went to try his luck somewhere else. That's what you people do, isn't it? No sense of responsibility or commitment. He left behind $3.40, sir." and valuable tools. A man doesn't abandon everything he owns without a word to anyone. People do strange things. Parrish picked up his newspaper again. A clear dismissal. If he turns up, let me know. But I'm not organizing a search party because some colored boy decided to move on. Thomas stood there for a moment, understanding flooding through him with terrible clarity. There would be no investigation, no search, no official interest whatsoever. In the eyes of the law, Benjamin Porter's disappearance didn't matter. It didn't even register as a problem worth acknowledging. Is there anything else? Parrish asked, not looking up from his newspaper. No, sir, Thomas said quietly. Nothing else. He walked out of the sheriff's office feeling a helplessness he hadn't experienced since before freedom. Different circumstances, but the same fundamental reality: their lives didn't matter to the people in power. But Thomas Hayes had not survived 34 years of slavery without learning resilience. If the authorities wouldn't search for Benjamin, the community would do it themselves. He organized a search party that afternoon. 15 men from Freeman's Quarter spent 3 days combing the woods and swampland around the settlement, calling Benjamin's name, looking for any trace. They searched in a grid pattern, making sure to cover every possible area. They waded through marshes, pushed through underbrush, checked abandoned structures. They found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, no discarded items, no body. It was as if Benjamin Porter had simply ceased to exist, evaporating into the October air without leaving a single trace behind. After 3 days, they had to give up. People had their own work to tend to, their own families to feed. They couldn't spend every hour searching for someone who had left behind no clues about where he'd gone. At church that Sunday, Reverend Matthew Foster, a man who had preached in secret during slavery and now led the congregation openly, said a prayer for Benjamin's safe return. The entire community bowed their heads, and Thomas Hayes listened to the words while feeling certainty grow in his chest. Benjamin wasn't coming back. Something terrible had happened to him. After the service, Thomas opened his ledger and made an entry in his careful script. October 27, 1867. Benjamin Porter, age 26, missing since approximately October 23rd or 24th. Last seen Wednesday evening, October 23rd, returning from Ashland proper with supplies. Cabin found undisturbed, all possessions present. Sheriff Parrish declined to investigate, suggesting Mr. Porter moved on. Community search conducted October 28th to 30th. No trace found. Status: missing. Circumstances: unknown. Thomas closed the ledger and sat for a long time, staring at the words he'd written. Something whispered in the back of his mind, a warning he couldn't quite articulate. But the warning was there, persistent and troubling. For several months, life returned to uneasy normalcy. People talked about Benjamin, especially in the early weeks. Theories circulated: maybe he'd had a sweetheart in another county he'd never mentioned, maybe he'd received word of his wife, Julia, and went to find her, maybe he'd simply decided he wanted a fresh start and hadn't wanted to explain himself to anyone. Thomas wanted to believe these things. He tried to convince himself that Benjamin had left voluntarily, that there was some reasonable explanation for the abandoned money and tools and unfinished work. But he couldn't make himself believe it. The pieces didn't fit. And as winter turned to spring, that feeling of wrongness only grew stronger. Spring came late to Ashland County in 1868. The winter had been harsh, colder than usual, with ice storms that knocked down tree branches and made travel treacherous. The community of Freeman's Quarter huddled through those cold months, burning wood to stay warm and eating through stored food supplies that were never quite enough. By March, when the weather finally began to warm, everyone was eager for renewal. Gardens were planted. Repairs postponed during winter were undertaken. Children who had been cooped up in small cabins ran outside to play in the mud and sunshine. Esther Vaughan was one of the busiest people in the community that spring. At 41, she was a midwife who had been helping bring babies into the world since she was 16 years old. She had delivered dozens of babies during slavery, both black and white, working without pay but with a reputation for skill and gentle care. After freedom, she continued her work, now receiving payment that allowed her to support herself and her daughter, Lizzie. Esther was a small woman with graying hair she kept wrapped in bright-colored scarves. She had quick, capable hands and a calm demeanor that put laboring mothers at ease. She carried a medical bag, a leather satchel that had been given to her by a white doctor who'd recognized her talent and taught her things beyond what she'd learned through experience. The bag contained basic instruments, clean cloths, herbal remedies she prepared herself, and a bottle of laudanum for the worst cases. She served both the black and white communities, one of the few people who regularly moved between Freeman's Quarter and Ashland proper without harassment. Even the most prejudiced white families recognized that Esther's skills were valuable. See you in the next video.